Hi, and welcome back to the Espresso at Home Sagebrush lesson series. I'm Kathryn, and this lesson is going to cover espresso shots. So an espresso shot is a very small amount of very concentrated coffee. It's strong, it's brewed under very high pressure, and because of that high pressure, it's topped by crema, which is that lighter colored, less dense layer of emulsified oils that float on top of the rest of the shot. Typically, its yield ratio, that is dose amount to yield amount, is about a 1 to 2-ish ratio. Some people would say between 1 to 2 and 1 to 3 is espresso. Some people would say between 1 to 1.5 and 1 to 2.5 is espresso, but it's in that range. You can go a little more concentrated and get a ristretto shot, or less concentrated and get a lungo or a long shot. And these are different types of preferences that all still fall under that umbrella that is espresso. So let's break that down a little bit. Dose is the starting point in an espresso. Dose is how much dry coffee you're going to be making your espresso from. Dose can be anywhere from a few grams, 7 grams being that old Italian standard, up to 30 or so. Ultimately, how you choose a dose is up to you, but there are some practical limitations, like how big of a filter basket do you have? How much caffeine do you want to be drinking? Typically, you would pick this very first when you set out to make espresso and not adjust it much after that. You might come back and tweak it again while you're dialing in. All of dialing in is a little bit of a cycle, but typically you won't change this until near the very end of your process. For the most part, you want to pick a dose and stick with it. Now, ratio or yield, these both kind of talk about the same thing. Yield is how much liquid beverage you get in your cup after you've pulled your shot, how much espresso is in that shot glass. Ideally, you would measure this in weight. Volume is certainly easier to eyeball, but there are a lot of variables that change the amount of crema, that less dense top layer that you get in your shot. So a 30-gram shot and a 40-gram shot might look like the same volume, but they'll taste very different. Ratios, as I mentioned, dose to yield. So you might want to make a 24-gram dose, because that's what your filter basket suggests, and a 1 to 2 ratio would mean you get a 48-gram yield. Assuming you pick a dose and stick with it through most of the dialing process, that ratio and that yield will remain linked and locked together. Drop your yield to 36 grams, now that's a 1 to 1.5 ratio, kind of on the edge of a ristretto and a normal shot. If you want to go up to a longer shot, maybe a 1 to 2.5 ratio, you would need to pull a 60-gram shot. I personally find it a little easier to think about dose and yields than dose and ratio, because when you start changing yields by a gram or two, you start getting ratios like 1 to 2.617, and I just don't want to do that much math before I've had my coffee for the day. However, picking the initial yields I'm going to look for is probably going to hover around that 1 to 2 or 1 to 2.5 ratio. Extraction. The extraction process is going to get an entire lesson to itself, so I will be covering this briefly. Extraction and strength are two related but distinct definitions. Extraction is how much of the dry coffee mass ended up in your cup. This is a percentage of the dose that we've used. Strength, on the other hand, or sometimes called concentration, is a ratio of how much coffee mass to how much water is in your cup. This could be measured and expressed with a TDS meter, that is total dissolved solids, how much solids are in how much water. So they both revolve around how much coffee solids get into the cup, but extraction is measured in relationship to the dose and strength is measured in relationship to the yields. To make matters more complicated, extraction and strength in espresso actually have an inverse relationship over the course of a shot. The more water that you pull through a dose of coffee, the more extraction you're going to get. But because your dose of coffee only has so much that it can give up, you're going to get less and less and less coffee mass out for each additional gram of water, meaning that your shot is getting weaker and weaker. For a simple, very exaggerated example, imagine making an Americano. You pull your shot and you pour it over more water. You haven't touched the extraction. The same total coffee mass is in your drink as was in the shot, and the dose hasn't changed at all. But you have introduced much more water and you have a less strong beverage. At some point, if you ran water over your grounds for 5 minutes, you'd be making terrible espresso, but you'd be in effect making a terrible Americano. You wouldn't be getting more extraction even though the water is running over the grounds. You're just weakening the shot. You've extracted everything you can. Like I said, there's an entire lesson on extraction where we'll go into theory a lot more alongside dialing in later on. So back to a few more parts of pulling a shot. Grind, I think, is the biggest one that people can have the most direct control over, and one of the first things you can probably improve with new equipment. As I've said, I'm not here to make specific recommendations on the equipment you should buy. I want to help you get the best you can with whatever you're using. But when we get to the lesson on grind and evenness, if you feel like you just can't get better, if you feel like you've hit a wall on how good your espresso can get, and if you think you have to upgrade something, I would upgrade the grinder before I bought a new espresso machine. Even a very cheap espresso machine can have a noticeable difference with a more consistent and more finely tuned grind. But if you upgrade your machine and still have a poor grinder that either can't go fine enough, or maybe it has too large of a distribution of grind sizes, you might actually find that things are going to go worse. Sometimes the more control over all the moving parts of espresso you have, the worse shot you can get. One other thing about grind and extraction, the depth of the bed changes the flow rate regardless of grind. A deeper bed at the same grind setting will actually have a slower flow rate than a shallower bed. So if you do have a deeper bed, maybe you've got a smaller portafilter, you'll actually have to go a little bit coarser than you might have gone otherwise. A full 58 millimeter portafilter, which is what most commercial machines have, and some home machines, that's designed to hold 24 grams, will actually have a shorter bed than a 53 millimeter portafilter basket that would be designed to hold 24 grams. We're going to cover grind in depth over a couple of lessons, so for now just keep in mind that this is a big one. Time is a little weird with espresso because it's not something you target exactly. Time in espresso is not like an immersion method where you can literally let the coffee sit immersed in the water for longer. The way that you adjust time are things like upping your yield, decreasing your grind size, changing that height in your coffee bed. So while you can get a sense of what happens based on your time, time is not something you directly influence. It is more of a measurement of your other factors. There is a suggested time frame for an espresso shot to run, and that's typically around 25 to 35 seconds, but that's a wide range, and that's not a hard and fast rule either. You might determine that for a particular coffee, what you need is a little longer of a window, and that's okay. But when you're just starting out, having a target is nice, because in many cases, the reason you're outside of that time window is because one of your other factors is off. Unfortunately, a lot of home machines are programmed with time in mind, so you may not have a mode that allows you to pull until you choose to stop, and you might have to use more of a guess and check method on your yield using time. So I'll cover that a little bit when we get to dialing, but just know that even if you do have to work based on your time, what you really want to be targeting is a yield. That should be your focus, not the time it takes to get there. You can go back and tweak other factors. If it is taking you 45 seconds to get a 48 gram shot that you're looking for as your yield, but you don't want to cut off your shot at 28 grams just because you've hit 30 seconds. And as I'll cover later, your machine might have to run fast if it doesn't have the ability to pre-infuse, because you can't grind as fine as you'd like to get the shot to take longer, but I'll cover that when I talk about grind and evenness. The last piece of the espresso puzzle is water. So much of your shot is water that the taste of the water you use will have a huge impact. One of Starbucks' claim to fame is that their water is so good it's triple filtered, and that's why people find their coffee good. Using a filtered water will make a big impact on your flavor. Without getting into a very chemical discussion, much of which I don't even fully understand, you typically want to make sure you have relatively filtered but not distilled water. If your water tastes like chlorine, so will your coffee. If your water is super hard, you won't be able to extract as much coffee, and you'll also have to deal with a lot of scale buildup in your machine, which is that white mineral buildup you often see on things like your sink spout or your dishwasher, which can clog your machine. But you also don't want to get distilled water and run it straight through your machine, because minerals found in water actually interact with coffee in a positive way when they're not overwhelming. Since coffee is acidic, some basic minerals actually add a balance. James Hoffman has this really interesting video where he takes a very acidic Kenyan coffee, brews it into espresso, and then uses sodium bicarbonate or baking soda as an acid buffer. That's a much more extreme example, but the same idea holds across all your coffees. If you want to get really nerdy, there are resin packets you can buy for hard water. I did use one of those before I had a water softener. There are also mineral packets you can buy to add the perfect amount of mineral to distilled water if you do have to buy distilled water. But again, I don't have any specific product recommendations to make. If you have absolutely no filtration for your water, and your water has a very unpleasant smell or unpleasant taste, or if your water is very, very hard, I do recommend getting something. Maybe a charcoal filter, maybe buying some sort of filtered water. But if your water tastes fine and it's not overly hard, this might be a piece to set on the back burner for later, even though it does impact the flavor. It might not be that important right now. So that is a brief shot breakdown. In the next lesson, we'll start getting deeper into extraction theory and then how strength and extraction play together. Thanks so much for watching. If you are watching this series on YouTube, be sure to subscribe. If you want to get into the next lesson, click on the link that should be in the bio. And if you want to jump into some other lessons about different coffee methods and other lessons that we have, visit sagebrushcoffee.com. Thanks for watching. I'm Kathryn, and I hope you have a great day.